Hello, this is Chapter 18, Late Agrarian Transitions, North Atlantic Revolutions, 1650 to 1800. Really going to try and get this done in 15 minutes today, but it's such an important chapter I may not be able to manage it. Anyway, we begin as usual with our framing the argument points. So the first point, the nature of Northwest European hierarchies as a group. So what was different, what was odd about these Northwest European hierarchies? And when we say different, we don't mean better, okay? We're not making some kind of argument here that there was something so special about Europe that it had very particular advantages in terms of economics or culture, etc. But something does happen in this period that we want to try to understand. And part of this is their failure to contain their merchant dilemma. In some ways, this failure leads to a capitalist outgrowth, okay? And then within these Northwestern European hierarchies, the English hierarchy in particular is very odd. And this is an oddity that allowed a new model of hierarchy to emerge in the early 18th century. And we spent quite a long time going into England and what happens in England. And this may be an approach to thinking about the American Revolution that you may not have encountered in school if you've gone to school in America, which tends to look for the causes of American Revolution within America itself and not place it in the bigger world sphere of what's going on, in particular what's going on and what's unique in England. So then the spreading impact of this new English political model and the screen images it creates on the American, French and Haitian revolutions. Okay, so as always, I'll talk a little bit about our readings and try to fit them together briefly with those framing arguments. So the first reading comes from Great Britain and is the 1689 Bill of Rights. Britain had a shared partnership between the monarch and Parliament since the Magna Carta of 1215. This period we're looking at here in the 17th century has already been quite a tumultuous period. There was the regicide of King Charles I, the interregnum under Oliver Cromwell, which was basically a military dictatorship, and then the restoration of Charles II and the re-emergence of monarchy in Britain. It was his son's James II's reign that kind of changed things again in Britain. James II was reputedly a Catholic, not a good thing to be for the head of the Church of England, and he was certainly married to a Catholic, and when that couple had a child, there were many people in Britain that were nervous about the return of a Catholic monarchy to Britain. So what they did is the Parliament asked James's sister, Mary, who was married to a good Protestant man, a Dutch prince called William of Orange, to come over and be king and queen instead, which they did, and they landed, and basically James and his wife and son ran away. And this event is called the Glorious Revolution because no blood was shed, and not only did it just replace one monarch with another, but it also reframed the way that the British Parliament looked at themselves. They were now kingmakers in some ways. And William of Orange went on to have very close ties with Parliament and work with Parliament very, very closely. Our second reading also comes from Britain, and that's from John Locke's Two Treatises of Government. John Locke is an epistemologist. He writes about the theory of knowledge, and he really built on Francis Bacon's work of inductive reasoning, which we talked about in the last lecture. And he wrote the Second Treatise of Government about theories of the origins of power and the proper limits of government. And along with Newton, who we met in the last lecture too, Locke and Newton are probably the two leading lights of this movement we call the Enlightenment in this period. Okay, so and then the next reading comes from the United States, actually from good old New York. And these images, the Bill of Rights and John Locke, go together to form a screen image of the rights of the Englishman. And we're still talking in 1735, at the time of the Zenger trial in the US, about a British colony in the United States. So John Peter Zenger was a newspaper owner who wrote some very critical things about the then British governor of the United States, of the United Colonies over there. And he was charged with seditious libel. Now, unlike regular libel, in which you have to prove that somebody's written a lie against you, seditious libel doesn't have to be proved in the same way. You don't have to prove that it's a lie, you just have to prove that it's seditious. And it certainly was seditious. It was a foregone conclusion he was going to be found guilty. Anyway, he had a very good lawyer called Andrew Hamilton, and that name should be familiar to you, who argued that a jury could make a finding not just on the determination of guilt, but also on the nature of the law. And this really saw the beginnings of a departure of the American system of legal system from the British legal system. Okay, moving on quickly. The next reading you have is the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, which you will mostly be familiar with if you have been educated in the United States, hopefully anyway. So this shows simmering resentments over different instances of British tyranny. And these are clashes over tax policy, American freedom to trade as they wished, and about continental expansion. Okay, so the Continental Congress of the 13 colonies decides to declare independence, and this is the statement that they produce of that intent drafted by Thomas Jefferson. And by 1783, as you all know, America had won its independence, and under this radical idea of a democratic government, which had not really been tried before, not in recent periods anyway. But it owes quite a lot to Locke, and look at those ideas when you're reading the American Declaration of Independence. The next document comes from France and is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And France was a very different place to England in that it had an absolutist monarchy. That means that the monarch exercised absolute power rather than a constitutional monarchy, as in Britain, which means that the British monarch rules constitutionally with a parliament. But France was not immune to events in Britain and America, and it had actually become involved in these events, lending money to the Americans to support their revolution against the British, because France and Britain were traditional enemies, and they were also simultaneously fighting a war. France and Britain were for control of India. Okay, so all this is going on. Louis XVI finds himself a little bit short of money and calls the Estates General, which is the British version of a parliament, except although a parliament had been meeting regularly since 1215, since the Magna Carta, but in France, the king had not called a parliament or the Estates General for several hundred years by this point. This is what we mean by absolute rule. They're not ruling with parliament at all, they just don't call it. So when the French call the parliament the third estate, and traditional Europe was divided into three estates. First, those that pray, the bishops, priests, etc., those that fight, the king, the knights, etc., and those who work, everybody else. But there'd been this change in society by this time. So the third estate weren't all grubby peasants by this time. There was also quite a wealthy middle class in France. So when they called this, and the voting was always by estate. So basically there were three votes. And the interests of the first two estates, the church and the nobles, always aligned against the interests of the third estate. So the third estate decided this was, BS, and they weren't going to go with that anymore. And they formed the National Constituent Assembly and launched the French Revolution. And this, one of its first acts was to publish this document. The next document we're going to read is also from France, and that is Olympe de Gouges' 791 Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. And in many ways, women had helped propel the French Revolution. They'd been, fully paid up members of the French Revolution, but they hadn't got representation. And they made a petition on that in that regards, and it failed. And so in response, Olympe de Gouges writes this sort of parody, this ancillary to the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which calls for equal rights for women. And this is something that will come out as you read the chapter, that women's rights actually decline in this revolutionary period, not increase. And then the final document are speeches and letters from the Haitian Revolution, written by Toussaint Louverture in 1801. And Toussaint was born a slave in Haiti, in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, as it was called at the time, and freed in 1776. Rose in society, got wealth and property. When the French had their revolution, and France was the colonizing power that controlled Haiti. When the French had their revolution, it destabilized the political situation in Haiti. And remember what we said last week when we were talking about the Atlantic slave trade, that some of these Caribbean colonies could have up to 90% of the population being enslaved. So this is already a very dodgy position. When the French rule is disrupted, when the whole legitimacy of the French monarchy is destroyed, Haiti and other places start to react to this. So a series of major slave revolts leads to all-out revolution, and Louverture rises to the top, writes this constitution, sends it to Napoleon. Napoleon didn't give up that easily. He sent troops to Haiti to try to oust the rebels, but they met with all kinds of calamities and disease and stuff like that, and he failed. And eventually in 1804, France conceded independence to Haiti. Okay, so that's that side. I'm certainly not going to get this done in under 15 minutes, am I? So that's that side. That's the readings. Okay. So patterns and principles, I'm always going to highlight these. I'm going to try and make you aware of them, make them try to jump out of the page a little bit more, because these are the kinds of things that you should try to remember, a few years after this course is over. So reductions in class power tended to be balanced by more strictly enforced gender power in agrarian hierarchies. So when you have a principle where you have a steep-sided pyramid, those at the top, whether they're men or women, enjoy the pinnacle of power, although the women's power is always less than men's power. But as you start to have a more even-sided pyramid, or even a circle, what happens is the gender component of this is pushed down. It doesn't continue to be equal to that of men of high class power, because the reduction in class power brings to the fore men of the middle class, whereas women of the upper class, who used to sort of have more power and influence, tend to be shoved down a little bit. It's one of those patterns, okay? So always remember that social structural reality is a construct, that people see reality through cultural frames. So if you ask them to describe what American society looks like today, what is the reality of the social structure of American society, you may get a very different answer from someone like me than you would get from, a member of the Tea Party, for example. Okay, so what we're going to talk about in this chapter is largely about how the increasing network flows of goods and people and ideas places a strain on traditional hierarchies. So we're looking at this model last week of Asian markets which close themselves off to foreign influence, and on the other end of the spectrum, the smaller, weaker, poorer northwestern European countries which actually try to form joint stock companies to try to suck some of this network power into government. Okay, so we have these two different ideas, and then also in the Northwest, we have in Northwestern Europe, they have these this legal contractual frame view, which we talked about as sort of being one of the components of how European elites see themselves. And these all made European elites vulnerable. These hierarchies were very vulnerable, and that's why they were vulnerable to revolution at this time. We see new wealth, and this is something that's very well portrayed in this painting here. Jean Lelouch and his family surrounded by images of status in their clothing, in their hairstyles. These are rich, wealthy people. Okay, so this upset the usual agrarian dynamic. The usual agrarian dynamic was that power leads to wealth. So if you have power, you can make money. When you upset this by having greater and greater network flows, what you now have is wealth can lead to power. So from the idea that power leads to wealth leads to power, okay? So this is the rise of the rich merchant families who eventually got so rich they could even abandon trade altogether and start buying up land and buying up government offices and creating a new nobility of military bureaucrats. And this is a sort of an alternative elite to the traditional elite. And then again, you have this this idea coupled with new knowledge. John Locke, you're going to read for this week. We talked about Newton last week, and their ideas that there are laws that govern the world, and it's up to intelligent people to find out these laws and change the state and the world in general for benefit within this, leads to theorizing of the state. In Europe, kingship had been thought to be sacred, and the divine right of kings to rule was unquestioned. Now, what starts to happen are two things in this period. The first, as the divine right of kings starts to be a little bit, you're going to have to explain that one a little bit to us a bit more, King Louis, and we'll get it. But as people start to articulate the divine right of kings and support it more, it actually moves from being a cultural frame to being something on the cultural screen. And if you put something on the cultural screen, it becomes open to scrutiny and greater debate. So people start talking about the divine right of kings a little bit more. And then the second thing that moves into this model is economic theory. Now, the prevailing economic theory of Europe at this time is called mercantilism. And what this means is that there's a certain amount of money in the world that's available. And a country makes every effort to increase its exports and decrease its imports so that they have this bigger share of the global market. So coupled with this, people are starting to think about state, monarchy, economies in a whole new way and think about new laws for these. Okay, I'm going to leave this part of the lecture there for